Welcome and thank you for joining us today. It's been such a long time since I've done an event in person, but I can't think of a better way of returning than to be interviewing you, the formidable and inspirational Julia Gillard, the only woman to have served as Prime Minister of Australia and the founder and chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at King's College London. We will be in conversation for roughly 40 minutes before I put some of your questions sent in advance to her. Now, as for me, if you're wondering who I am, I'm Angela Saini, a science journalist and a King's alumnus myself. I did an MA in the Department of War Studies here some years ago. And I also represented King's in Celebrity University Challenge with the only all-women team, should I add, and we reached the semi-finals. I've written 3 books, but the reason I mention that is because one of them is particularly relevant to our discussion today. It looks at how scientists have historically misjudged women, in large part because of the modern Western scientific establishment being built on this belief that women are somehow the natural inferiors of men, which some people still believe. The structures we live and work in determine how power is exercised. And Julia Gillard certainly has first-hand experience of how historically biased institutions can treat women. Many of you will know the unashamed sexism that she faced as Prime Minister and how she also so skillfully and beautifully challenged it. She blazed a trail for women in Australian politics and also in some ways for women all over the world. But like so many women in work, whether as leaders or not, her experience demonstrates the minefield that so many of us still have to navigate, whether we are leaders or just working women. It's sometimes a matter of just not knowing whether and how you are being judged differently. The Global Institute for Women's Leadership is a remarkable organization, and I'm saying that as a journalist, as someone who has looked at its work properly. It works through research, practice, advocacy, and engagement, helping to build a world in which women of all backgrounds can have a fair and equal access to leadership, and also challenging cultural stereotypes of what it means to be a leader. I can highly recommend its recently published essays on equality, which look at how to recover from the pandemic in a more gender equal way. They're remarkably sensitive and thoughtful. So, Julia, welcome to you. It's an absolute thrill to be here with you. Can I just start by asking you, what brought you to establishing this institute?
Well, thank you for doing this interview, and it does feel quite surreal to be doing something in person. It's like people have leapt into 3D instead of being in 2 dimensions, so that is delightful. For me, establishing the Global Institute for Women's Leadership was part of a process of answering a set of questions in my head, which had been whirring around since I left Australian politics. I left the Prime Ministership thinking about my experiences. I obviously wrote about my experiences, and I was trying to unpack how much of the history of those times was about, just politics in Australia then, how much was about decisions I and the government made, how much was simply because I was a woman. And I looked, when I was writing my memoirs, into the global research base about women leaders, because I thought rather than just writing about me, I'd want to cite it in something broader, other women's experiences. And whilst there were wonderful pieces of research around, I didn't think that, given how long we've been at this task of gender equality, that the research was in any way deep enough, thoughtful enough, or action-oriented enough. There's no point having all of these wonderful research works if they don't live in the real world and change things in the real world. I then had the opportunity to be at the Policy Institute at King's, which impressed me so much because of its action focus. It wants to change things. And so I thought, why can't we do something absolutely focused on women's leadership? And here we are several years later, and I'm just delighted at the progress that Professor Rosie Campbell and the remarkable team she leads has made.
I was watching the coverage of the G7 meeting, and I imagine that being a woman head of state or a woman leader is like being part of a club. And I did wonder, was there a sense in which you felt a camaraderie with other women leaders? Did that really exist?
Yes, absolutely. I went to a number of international meetings. I famously went to one. I made the point at the time, APEC, which is the Asia Pacific Economic Forum. So it brings together enough countries in the world that it covers more than half of the world's GDP. And I was the only woman there. So that was an experience. But many of the meetings I went to, there were a limited number of other women, always disproportionately men. But when I went to things like the G20, the women did find each other. So you would actually end up talking to Christine Lagarde from the IMF and Chancellor Merkel, and you would share experiences about being women leaders. I think that there was just a natural seeking of each other out because we were all so used to being in these incredibly male-dominated environments.
So the question of women's leadership, when you're taking a research approach to that, what kind of questions are you asking then? Is it just about why there aren't enough women leaders, or is it more about, you know, the grassroots? How do we get women to imagine that they could be taking these positions?
It's all of it. I mean, we take a topic-based approach. So clearly in the days of this continuing pandemic, we've been very focused on the impact of all of the arrangements, the health arrangements, the economic arrangements around the pandemic on women, the domestic arrangements. But we, in working out what barriers we want to address, take what we refer to as a glass labyrinth approach. So everybody, I think, is very familiar with the glass ceiling, you know, the women who were near the top, who hit their head on that final hard glass ceiling, the way Hillary Clinton did when she contested for the presidency. And of course, we're interested in that because looking at the experiences of someone like Hillary Clinton can give us a lot of knowledge about remaining gender barriers. But we really want to look at the flow across a woman's life. So right from the time that women are making decisions about where to go in the world of work, where to start, what kind of businesses, what kind of companies, political parties, what have you, and then everything that happens in their journey across working life, where they are treated differently and lesser than men are treated. So we're talking about a very expansive concept of leadership. It's not just the traditional be at the top of the pyramid power structure. Yes, of course, we want to look at that because if we look at the pyramid power structures in all our societies, we should see an equal number of women. But we do want to challenge notions about what leadership looks like and is. And I think that resonates in leadership in localised levels and in very different context from the traditional pyramid.
So you just mentioned Hillary Clinton there. When she was fighting that election, did you feel some affinity or could you relate to some of the experiences that she had there?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, these insults that get thrown at women leaders, they are circulated around the planet. I mean, things that were said about me were recycled from insults thrown at Hillary Clinton when she first put herself forward for contention as the president in her initial round. And then things that were said about me and other women leaders were repurposed to be said about Hillary Clinton during her presidential campaign. So my view really is, you know, sexism is global, misogyny is global. And given that, we've got to be working together globally, which is why it is unambiguously the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. We've got to be working together globally to challenge all of this, to challenge the structural barriers that hold women back and the stereotyping barriers that hold women back.
One of the interesting things in that American election was that so many women also didn't vote for Hillary Clinton. And why do you think that was in that case? Especially since, you know, this was the first opportunity they had to have a different kind of leader, to have a woman leader.
Yeah. When we think about sexism and stereotypes, I think it's pretty easy for us to say, oh, well, they're in other people's brains, not our brains. But the research actually shows very clearly that they're in everybody's brains, men and women. And when we look at women leaders, we are very quick to conclude, for example, that they're not likeable. Because the stereotypes we have in our head about, you know, men is that we expect them to be commanding, controlling. If we see a leader who's acting like that, that's fine. We expect women to be nurturing, empathetic, kind. So if we see a woman acting in a commanding or controlling way, we easily conclude, you know, she's not very likeable. I've used the terminology, she's a bit of a bitch. I know some people wouldn't like the use of that word, but I think it's the word that pops into a lot of people's minds. And I think we saw all of that on display for Hillary Clinton in the minds of men and women. And of course, there were a set of economic and social pressures, sections of America that felt deeply left behind and who were wanting to pay out the establishment of which they concluded Hillary Clinton was a part and endorse the outsider, Donald Trump. So I think it was working at a series of levels.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting also is that the US, which is seen as a very progressive country in so many ways when it comes to gender equality, has never had a woman president. And yet there are many countries in the world, particularly in the global south, who have had women leaders and do have women leaders. And particularly when it comes to women in STEM. So this is a subject close to my heart as a science journalist, but it's always been fascinating for me to look at what some of the reasons why there are quite high rates of women in STEM in, for example, Eastern Europe, parts of the Middle East and South America, and very low rates in Western Europe and in the US and in Australia. So these things that kind of challenge our stereotypes of how the world should look in terms of gender equality, how do they feed into your understanding of how the world works and how sexism and misogyny play out globally?
I think there are some things that are at work everywhere. And I've had the opportunity to talk to a number of women leaders around the world. And of course, the Institute looks at all of the global research. And I think we can conclude that there are some stereotypes that play out everywhere. You know, a disproportionate interest in appearance, a disproportionate interest in family structures, who's looking after the kids while you're getting on with this business of leadership. These stereotypes about whether or not you're offending against what we think women should be like, I think they are pretty universal. But then when you do the dig, you do see some things that are different in national contexts. And one of the things we are determined to build is a global index of women's leadership. Of course, there are a number of global data sets about how women are positioned. The World Economic Forum, for example, does a very comprehensive one each year and ranks countries. But we want to get an index that pulls out the leadership piece across politics, business, civil society, the law, etc. And we think by doing that and contrasting and comparing, we will go to some national examples. You've gone to some. Another one, for example, is software engineering in Malaysia is much more feminised than it is in Australia or the UK or the US. And then when we find that, we can dig in and say, well, what's different and what can we learn from that and uplift and take elsewhere?
That's so exciting. I mean, that's the kind of research I personally want to see being done. Can you describe some of the other institutes' work that's been done recently, particularly anything that surprised you?
Well, lots of things continue to surprise me. Unfortunately, they routinely surprise me on the downside. I'd like to be routinely surprised on the upside. You would recall during the early days of the pandemic particularly, there was a lot of discourse about were women leading better during the pandemic? And I was kind of delighted to see that discourse. I wasn't sure whether it was statistically all that solidly based, but it still delighted me that we were having the right discussion, that people were prizing strength and empathy. They were looking at women who combined these characteristics. I hoped it would take us in a direction of questioning, do we ask men to be as empathetic or do we just accept it when they're strong? Yeah. So we're putting a differential burden on the shoulders of the women. So I thought it was a good discussion. But at the Global Institute, we have a language processing tool where we can look at reams and reams and reams of text very quickly. And we did that and looked at news reports in the UK, the US, Australia about the pandemic. And we found that whilst there was all this lauding of female leadership, mostly when it came to reading about the pandemic and experts on aspects of the pandemic, they were overwhelmingly male. In your area, the likelihood of hearing a female voice was 1 in 20. And really very big gender skew towards men. in economics. And then if you controlled for the gender of the leader, because obviously the president, the prime minister is going to be very routinely heard, but if you control for that and look at the next most quoted politicians, once again, overwhelmingly male. So in some ways it was a reminder that whilst there are wonderful success stories in women's leadership in our world, Jacinta Ardern, for example, in my region of the world, we can't allow that to avert our gaze from how deep and continuing the problem is elsewhere.
I was reading some of the research that your team has written on this, and what I was relieved to read was that they didn't fall into these kind of essentialist tropes about women being naturally empathic, and that's why, you know, they make empathic leaders, but reminding us that these are gender ideas that we have that affect the way that we are cultured into society, the way that we are if you like, inducted into womanhood, and then that kind of shapes the way that we might think about becoming leaders. But that's not to say that women can't be very tough and terrible leaders sometimes as well. We have to remember.
Yeah, I think this is such an important point, and as feminists, we can fall for it a bit. We can fall for the trope that there is a natural style of male leadership and a natural style of female leadership, and then laud what we think is the natural style of women's leadership. And all of that, I think, is a big trap because it sets us up for saying we will support a woman leader if she's fantastic and she combines strength and she combines empathy and we'll just love it. Whereas we'll cheerfully go and vote for a bloke who, you know, looks like he kind of knows what he's doing but hasn't got any other characteristics. And if we fall for that, then we're always going to limit the number of women leaders. And I think we're going to limit the dialogue about what leadership is. I mean, I've joked in the past, we'll know we've got to gender equality in leadership when you've got an election contest between a woman who says, you know, you should vote for me because I am the hardest bastard here and I will get the job done. And a man is there pitching saying, I'm really kind, I'm really empathetic, I put the team first and that's why I'd like your vote. You know, and when we've got that contest, then we'll be able to say, well, we're in a different world than the one we are now, where we always put the view that the women should be showing empathy and kindness.
I mean, that's the issue with minorities, is that you feel that as a minority, you're representing everyone in your group, not just yourself as an individual.
That's true. And I mean, it does give way to this kind of glass cliff analysis. And yes, there's a hell of a lot of glass, you know, ceilings, labyrinth, cliff. But it happens all the time that if a woman, often an organisation in trouble, will decide to shake things up, they will appoint the first woman. She's been handed a pretty, you know, hard hand of cards to play. And if she doesn't play them out perfectly, then the conclusion will be, well, we kind of knew that women weren't up for this, weren't the right skill set for this. And so we've got to be very alive to that as well. In what circumstances did women get to lead? This is very much on my mind because my co-author for the book that I wrote last year, published last year on women and leadership, is Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's just become the new Director General of the World Trade Organization. Well, in this world, pretty hard to imagine a harder job. And yet she is very conscious that if it doesn't go well because of the underlying structural tensions in global trade, people will say, oh, well, we tried a woman and that didn't work.
Yeah, and then that affects all women in the future, which is, yeah. Now, I want to move slightly here and look at the reasons that, you know, different women make the choices that they do and how that reflects in leadership. Because we have to remember, you know, all over the world, women sit right across the political spectrum, on the right and on the left. And some of those women sitting on the left, on the right as leaders, will sometimes not be in favour, for example, of immigration or minority rights, or maybe anti-abortion, or against some things that other feminists are fighting for. How do we navigate a world in which we are pushing for female leadership? We can't always be confident that a woman leader will always be there for women.
Yeah, I think in some ways we've got to separate the concepts in our head, which is You know, clearly I'm from the progressive side of politics, but I would want in my nation for it to be equally likely that a woman would rise to leadership in my political party, the Labor Party, and in the Conservative parties which we contend against. And, you know, if a woman leader came through on the Conservative side, obviously it's never happened, but if it did happen, then of course I would be opposed to her election and opposed to her policies, but it would still be good to see that she hadn't been artificially held back by gender stereotypes in that political party. And we had a real-time example of this in the state of Queensland, which many people would associate in their minds with the Great Barrier Reef for good reason, very beautiful part of the world. But the last state election was conducted between two women, a woman from the Labor Party who was Premier and was seeking to be Premier again, and the woman leading the Conservative side of politics. And, you know, it was interesting to see how aspects of the media went with that. Some just reported the politics the same way they would if there'd been two male leaders. You know, someone said this about healthcare and someone said this about jobs, but there were any number of pieces which were comparing how these two women dressed, for example, how different was it or how similar was it? So, you know, even in those circumstances, two women contending, you ended up in many ways defaulting back to sexist stereotypes.
And one of the other issues here, I mean, one of the positive things that have happened in this wave of feminism is that we're looking at intersectionality and the way in which different systems or axes of oppression affect individual women differently, particularly in the last year with Black Lives Matter. Then how are you feeding those different concerns into the kind of research that you're leading here at the Institute?
It's incredibly important to us to take an intersectional lens to everything we do, and we're very determined to strengthen that as we continue to build the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And you know, unsurprisingly, whenever we can sort of separate out the analysis, and, you know, sometimes there are constraints on doing that because the underlying data sets might give you data based on gender, but they don't further break it down in a way that enables you to take an intersectional lens to it. So there's still much to do to make sure that disaggregated data is available. But we do take an intersectional analytical lens. We try and use intersectional data whenever possible. And when we do that, what you always surface is this interplay of gender and race, which means that women of colour, women from minority groups have a different cocktail of prejudices coming in their direction.
And one of the things we have seen in the last year is that there has been this huge push for disaggregating data and having more data, not just on gender, but on all other axes of oppression. But the data itself is rarely enough because it's the way you diagnose it, isn't it? And I do sometimes get concerned that the way the data is diagnosed, sometimes in a reactionary way, can misplace what the root of that disparity really is. So, you know, as a researcher, then how do you get to the root of that and prevent, you know, the public in this age of social media from diagnosing it from themselves once they see the statistics?
Yeah, I think that there is a lot of misuse of statistics and lack of context. And look, I think, you know, even, you know, we can use the pandemic as an example. You know, in the early days of the pandemic, lots of people were running around saying, well, this isn't going to be so bad because, you know, the death rate as a percentage, it's really, really low. And then you've got to go, hang on, context, you know, might be a low percentage, but of a really big number, global population, that's a lot of people who are at risk of dying. That's why this is serious. And yet we'll see headlines that take a number just completely devoid of context. So, I mean, for us, we've always got to be trying to not just present the statistical analysis, but go deeper into what is it telling us about the barriers. Lived experience can help us, you know, talking to women, working with activist organisations can help us get to that. And then what would shift those statistics? And at the end of the day, you know, the statistics are important because they give you a snapshot, but we're in the change business. You know, we want to look, find out what's happening, work out what the best evidence would be to change the many manifestations and barriers of sexism, of racism, and then make a difference to it.
Finally, I wanted to ask you about the domestic, because it does feel as though this is the one area, this is a universal, you know, all women face this challenge or this expectation that the burden of housework and childcare should fall on them. And that affects, you know, us in all different industries, wherever we are, but including women leaders. Now, I have to say, on my part, I was very lucky. I grew up in a very egalitarian family in which my parents split everything down the middle, and they still do. And I've tried to institute that in my own relationship as well. My husband and I split everything at home. But how do we build a world in which that is the norm? Because it still shocks me that it isn't. It really does seem to be the sticking point here.
Oh, it's a huge sticking point. And this wasn't a Global Institute piece of research, but there was a piece of research during COVID here in the UK. I shouldn't say during COVID because we're still in COVID, but during the height of the lockdowns is what I mean. There was a piece of research that showed that in male-female couples, where both of them worked full-time, and she was the highest income earner, even in those circumstances, she was disproportionately stepping up to the additional burdens because of lockdown and homeschooling. And so, you know, this gave a lie to the traditional economic analysis, which is, you know, mostly men tend to be higher income earners. So for a family economic unit, if someone's working time has to give way, then it makes economic sense for that to be the lower income earner. Just shows you that's not what's happening. It's not a rational economic analysis. It's gender bias playing out in the household. I think we've got a lot to do to get these, you know, what happens in the home to be discussed and clear. And, you know, little tricks and tools for that, I think, can make a big difference. A friend of mine in Sydney in Australia, she got this pack of kind of cards that was going around. It's a game you play with your family. And it's broken up all of the household jobs. So, you know, who does the laundry, you know, who walks the dog, you know, who cleans the bathroom, all of that kind of stuff. And it's got the kind of tasks in there that children might do, you know, cleaning up their own room, those kinds of things. And you sit with your family and you divvy out the cards. So who does this chore? Okay, well, you know, to your young child, you do make sure the dog's water bowl is full, so you can have that one. But as you do it, inevitably, the woman ends up with, and everybody ends up with a couple. And then you can say, what's wrong with this? You know, and
the worst game of poker ever.
The worst game of poker ever. And what cards could we take out of mum's hands that other people could do? So I think those kind of devices that get the conversation going in households are really important.
There does seem to be a kind of mental block here, though. So, for example, I have a cleaner who comes to my house weekly. And this week, the agency told me, we will be sending a male cleaner. Are you okay with that? They've never asked me before, are you okay with a female cleaner? But this time they did. And I've really been mulling it through in my head. Why would I not be okay with it? Is it a safety thing that they're talking about? I don't know. Or is it that people are uncomfortable with the idea of men just even doing jobs that traditionally women have done in the home?
Wow, that's interesting.
It is interesting.
It's really, really interesting. There is plenty of research about negative reactions to people holding gender incongruent roles. And it's a good reminder that, you know, stereotyping doesn't just work one way. You know, whilst disproportionately stereotyping is about women and confines women, there are a set of stereotypes which mean when men go into, you know, female occupations, people look very oddly at that. And a man who has gone into a female occupation and makes a mistake is also at risk that, you know, people are really saying to themselves, I knew he couldn't do it, you know, because he's just not the right person. We should have got a woman to do it. So, you know, we've got to unpack this from all dimensions.
Yeah, I mean, it really cuts both ways. Gender equality has to mean that all of us are buying into this idea that we can do everything, men and women, and everyone in the system. Now, I want to ask you 2 more questions, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience. But the first one is, a lot of people during this pandemic have been saying we want to build back better. We want to build a society that is fairer now that we have this opportunity to do it. Do you think that's likely?
I think it's still to play for. I think there really are 2 futures in front of us, and the activism and advocacy now will make a difference to, how much we're on the good path and how much we're on the bad path. I can see a future in which we take from the pandemic a series of lessons that we absolutely didn't need to learn, where we reevaluate caring work. So, it's not just people clapping for the National Health Service, but people at a more profound level saying to themselves that these highly feminised jobs are what got us through. And on an ongoing basis as a society, we should reevaluate how we reward and view these positions. That as we move beyond the days of economic stimulus to the jobs rebuild, that given it's been disproportionately women's jobs that have been lost, that we don't simply get out the same old toolkit for past recessions when it's been mainly men's jobs that have been lost, that we actually do things that bolster female labour force participation. And whilst not all jobs can be done virtually, many require in-person attendance, but for those that can be done virtually, that we are very thoughtful about how we take the best of what we've learned in this period with us. And that will be a profound restructuring of work. It won't just be a optionalised, okay, come to the office a couple of days a week and the other days you can stay home. If we just do that, I think what's very likely to happen is men will disproportionately go to the office, women will disproportionately stay home and work from there, and they will be invisible. And so when it comes to promotion time or training opportunity time, they won't be the ones that get it. And we'll wake up in 5 or 10 years' time in a more gendered version of the workforce than the one we went into the pandemic with. I think too, there's things that we could hear and make a real effort, a sustained effort around women's voices and leadership, given the dialogue we've had around that during the pandemic, and on these domestic front questions. So that, I think, is the optimistic version. The pessimistic version is we don't learn much, that it's a clumsy move back to business as usual, and to the extent that we take anything new with us, it's just plonked on top of business as usual without a gender analysis, and it exacerbates pre-existing inequalities. So, at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, one of the reasons we're publishing things like essays on equality is this is a key time to be sharing the insights about how we can truly build back better.
And finally, I wanted to ask you about policies that you have seen yourself really have a transformative effect, that you can see really work, that governments could adopt.
Oh, I think, looking at how you do parental leave can make a huge difference, how that is, whether that's done at all, because there are obviously many societies where there's no real paid parental leave entitlement, and if it is done, how it's done between men and women, so that the benefit structure doesn't reinforce that raising children is women's work. So paid parental leave, childcare arrangements, schooling arrangements can make a huge difference on women's labour force participation. The way in which organisations evaluate merit, do their recruitment, promotion structures, their work and family life structures, so that there aren't artificial barriers in the way of women. And then this thorny question about how we can surface stereotypes and work them through. Most of these stereotypes, if we get them out of the back of our brain and hold them up in the sunlight, they can't hold, they're just so stupid. But it's the systematic process of getting them out of the back of people's brains.
Yeah, but they exist in so many different respects, like you've said, in both ways, the positive stereotypes as well as the negative ones, and we all have them. So what have you done to try and, I also have been through this process of trying to force myself not to think in these ways, but how have you done it?
Yeah, I mean, this for me being with the wonderful researchers at the Global Institute, I learn something every day, which is fabulous. And so that's helped me understand these barriers more than I did. The work Ngozi and I did writing the book helped us understand them again. But, you know, as much as anybody else will catch myself making a judgment that you've then got to unpack. You know, why are you, you know, looking at a screen and making a judgment about how a woman appears or making a judgment about her character based on how she's dressed? You know, we easily slip into these old tropes that have been in our heads for forever, in my case, many decades, longer than you. You know, it's a day-to-day work to catch yourself thinking about them. And then there's, you know, structural work to be done. I mean, you know, many people run committee meetings, discussions at work, you know, Zoom, whatever. And you can think about, have we invited people into the conversation? Is this playing out on the basis that men are talking more? Have I created an environment where the person who speaks loudest wins the outcome because they've got biases? You know, that's all got biases in it. So yes, there's a lot to think through, but also a lot of structural change needed. This is not just individual work, this is collective work in terms of structural change. So how we run organisations is different.
I do think people underestimate the extent to which structures, including governments, the state, can shape the way gender norms work in society, that once parental leave exists, people think about the roles of men and women differently.
Oh yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if we, you know, track over time some of the, you know, simpler changes, you know, I am of that generation. You know, when I first qualified in the law, there was an active debate about whether women could wear trousers in court. Like, it just, you know, it makes me sound like I was, you know, a contemporary of Dickens. I assure you I wasn't. But, you know, that we could have even had that discussion, but it was a live discussion. Now, all of these years later, you know, the fact you laughed just shows it's done, it's dusted, it's gone, it's ridiculous, and we've moved on to other barriers. So yes, you know, it is possible. Once an organisation like a court finally says to itself, you know, this old fuddy-duddy stuff's ridiculous, we're throwing it out of the window, then it's you know, might be a decision about dress, but it's got ramifications about, do you really think a woman belongs in a courtroom as an advocate, or is she unusual somehow, you know, shouldn't be here? And so that, I think, you know, small decisions make a big difference.
And it kind of puts the issue to rest, if you like, in terms of the public debate, that we don't have to keep having this conversation because the courts have rested it for us.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
So very quickly, though, the Institute, what is it planning now? Because I'm very keen to know what kind of research is going to be coming up in the future.
Well, very, very soon we will be launching work on gender pay gap reporting, where we've looked around the world to compare current regimes to see how they're working, to identify what would be the best way of reporting on gender pay differentials and to mobilise around that. So plenty for people to get involved in and to do. And that will be associated with the Generation Equality Forum, the UN forum, which is coming up in Paris and, of course, is overwhelmingly virtual.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, I look forward to that. Now, we've got some brilliant questions from the audience, and I'm very sorry that I can't put all of them to you because there's just too many, but I've picked out a few. The first one, you have touched on this already, but I'd love you to go into it a bit more. Caroline Rayburn, who did Spanish and French in 1991 here at King's, she asked, what prompted you to choose King's for the Global Institute for Women's Leadership?
It was really this outwards focused culture, and because it's so endemic here at King's, it's easy to underestimate how unusual that is in higher education institutions. I don't want to be unkind about other universities, but I think one of the great problems for the sharing of knowledge in our world is that so much of it resides within universities but doesn't bust out into the community and make a difference. And I think King's, because of its siting here in the centre of London, you know, very near the political and financial power centres. This outwards looking culture is just baked in. And so it was the right place for an institute like this.
Yeah, and it's surprisingly well connected. I mean, this is one of the reasons I went to the War Studies department, is because it has such great links with the security and intelligence community in the UK. People don't realise this, but yeah, I can understand that. And Eleni Pavlopoulos, who did English law and French law in 1988, and she has written this question on behalf of the girls at Channing School who are watching right now. Hello, everyone at Channing.
Hello.
You experienced a great deal of misogynistic commentary during your time as Prime Minister, she writes, but also fought back against it, perhaps most notably when telling Tony Abbott in the chamber that I will not be lectured about misogyny by this man. How did your experience of womanhood in that context affect your political career and perhaps also your political beliefs?
Well, I went into my political career already an active feminist. You know, I became, well, I guess I always intuitively believed girls and boys were equal, and I grew up in a household that it was just my sister and I, so it's not like we had lived experience of a brother being treated differently. And we were taught by our parents, you know, my father and mother, to aim high. We weren't taught that, you know, women somehow had a subordinate place in society. So I had that foundation stone. I went to university and joined that with a more thoughtful analysis of feminism. I didn't study gender studies or anything like that. That most assuredly wasn't a thing when I was in university, but I became active in the student movement, so I learned a lot about it. So I went into my political career knowing that political parties were predominantly male institutions, and I and a cohort of women at that time were determined to change that. So we did things like have our political party adopt an affirmative action rule, which has transformed it. You know, at the federal level in Australia now, it's basically half men, half women, which is a sea change from what it was like when I was first active. What I underestimated was how pernicious and pervasive sexism was, and how long-lived it was going to be. If you'd asked me in my 20s, I would have said, look, by the time I'm in my 40s, you know, most of this will be done and dusted, it'll be fixed, only to find that, you know, during my political career, it was well and truly there. So, you know, feminism informed my politics. My experience as a woman leader have informed my feminism in this stage of my life. So in some ways, it's been a big circle. We did, apart from, you know, sort of our own experiences as women in politics and women in our political party, also mobilised to make sure that our political party had, you know, pro-women policies. And so it's the Labor Party that's brought a lot of things like paid parental leave to Australia, different childcare arrangements and the like. So I am proud of that. But of course, always more to do. And so that's the journey for people who are still in Australian politics.
I'm intrigued about whether your feminism evolved or changed during that period. Was it the same as it was when you were a student?
I think it was the same. I was always a, you know, sort of pragmatic feminist. I was in the business of getting things done and change made and happening. I think one of the things about politics, the sheer relentlessness of it, means that you don't get much opportunity to either reflect or celebrate feminist milestones. And even with the best of my female colleagues, when we got something big done, we didn't stop and celebrate. It was like, okay, next, what's the next thing on the to-do list? And I've said that in the years since, because I get a bit more time to myself, that I think now I'm a more sensitive feminist. I'm much more, you know, prone to spend time reflecting and celebrating when things go well, rather than relentlessly rushing on to the next thing on the to-do list. So my feminism has evolved. It's got a more emotional thread these days than perhaps I had time to have or let myself have during the real rough and tumble of politics. Charlene
Hales, who did the nursing freestanding module in 2018, She asks, what advice would you give to budding female politicians starting their careers now, particularly regarding boundaries and assertion?
Well, first and foremost piece of advice is always go for it. I think whenever we have discussions about gender, I'm always conscious that there may be women out there who are thinking to themselves, well, I was motivated to try and become a leader, but now I've heard all of that, you know, it's not for me. So go for it. Go for it, but recognise that there will continue to be these gender barriers. And one of the things that I think the coming generation has got is the ability to war game in advance. You know, in some ways you've got the benefit that you've seen this movie before. And so that is a real superpower. Use it, you know, get ready for those moments when they come. And then I think, you know, be collective, reach out to other women to keep changing the things that need to. I mean, one thing that gives me a lot of optimism for the future is women and supportive men are much more likely to rush in now when something clearly unequal happens to a woman in leadership. You know, when I was in politics, there was still this, you know, question, oh, well, isn't she being treated like every other Prime Minister's ever been treated? Oh, it's just the normal, you know, kind of ups and downs of politics. There's no need to bring a gender lens to any of this. Why would we play the gender card, get involved in, you know, the gender war, et cetera, et cetera? Now I think, you know, that's gone. People realise there's a gender analysis. People see it when there's a sexist moment and they rush in to name it. And that should give us a lot of energy for change, but that will be collective energy.
Do you think social media has had some part to play in that?
Yes, I do. I think social media is a bundle of contradictions from a feminist perspective. I think it's enabled us to mobilise globally in a way we weren't able to do before. The Me Too campaign is, you know, the classic example of that. It enables us to rush in and to point out gendered treatment in real time, but it is filled with bile and misogyny and can be such an unsafe space for women.
Yeah, I recognise that. One more question here on behalf of Channing School. Following the increased attention paid to institutional racism in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, what steps do you believe need to be taken, and in particular, what concrete policies should be implemented in order to create or further equality and equity for Australia's Aboriginal population?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are people with lived experience that it would be good to have this conversation with, but as an Australian politician, the approach I think we've needed, and it's taken us far too long to find, with Indigenous Australia, is to find a spirit of openness, of reconciliation, of partnership, of recognition of prior ownership of the land, of being truly prepared to recognise the value of the world's oldest continuing culture, and to include it in the life of the nation. And so I think Australia is still feeling its way on that. Some things have got better, but there is a journey of change in front of us. There is a statement, it's called the Uluru Statement from the Heart, from Indigenous leaders, which helps chart the pathway forward. And then there are very practical things around service provision, social supports, economic empowerment, where the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australia are large. And in that, the nation has adopted what's called a closing the gap strategy. So we measure and monitor those gaps and try and close them. That was actually an initiative of my predecessor, Prime Minister Rudd, and it is still part of the Australian political landscape and public policy setting, and it's very important. It holds the nation to account each year on what is happening to ensure that Indigenous Australians are not left behind when it comes to their citizen entitlement and what they're entitled to expect as Australians.
Can you imagine a day when there will be an Indigenous Prime Minister of Australia?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. I don't know whether I'll live to see it. I hope so. but there is certainly more inclusion now, not enough, but more inclusion than at any point in Australia's history of Indigenous Australians in our federal parliament.
And this question, which actually I've heard from quite a few people before, this is Kim Yun Kung, and she did defence studies in 2019. As an Asian female naval officer, I have also faced double gender standard and male dominant working culture. It has not been easy to speak out because I didn't want to be seen as a feminist in that kind of environment. How can I raise my voice without offending men?
Yeah, that's hard. That's a hard question. I think one way of trying to make this not a confrontation, and I can understand in many environments where women don't feel like they want it to be a confrontation, is to go to the evidence. I mean, I think, rightly or wrongly, people will react very differently to an accusation that they are doing something sexist versus the exposure of the evidence that shows that structures that work like this tend to have sexist outcomes. And so I think in that sense, in trying to cool the temperature, the analytical material can very much be of use. Now, I don't think that's going to fix everything. Not that if I could fix, if I had a piece of advice that fixed it all, I'd be one, proud of myself, and two, very, very pleased to share it. But I think it's so complicated. But I do think, sometimes starting discussions based on that analytical end can help.
Just from your own experience then, because I studied engineering, I know what it's like to be in a male-dominated culture, and for me it was about picking your battles. I couldn't argue every single time with every person. What approach did you take in those circumstances?
Oh, very much the same. If I'd spent every day in politics taking up every microaggression, every, use of sexist language, every stereotype when it was being applied to me, I wouldn't have done anything else. So, I did pick my battles, early on as part of this sort of feminist grouping. We picked the structural battle. If we could change who went into the parliament, if we could change our political party, it would make a difference, and it has. We picked our policy battles. We did seek to put analysis at the centre, so to have gender analysis of policy changes so that the evidence could speak for itself. And, I, in the life of my Prime Ministership, actually took the decision when I first became Prime Minister that I didn't need to be out there battling on the basis of, did anybody tell you I'm the first woman to hold this job? It was so obvious I was the first woman. I thought some of the gendered treatment would correct over time. And so when it got worse, it's then that I took the moment to call it out. So yes, I do think you've got to pick the time, pick the method, pick the time.
And here we have from Lizzie McWhirter, Education Studies 1991, and I think this may be the last question. Who has inspired you? Can you tell us about your favourite memory or your most surprising moment? Do you have a favourite book or author you like to read, or favourite musician you listen to when having some much needed space for reflection? So this is almost like a self-care question, which you often get. But is there one place that you go to make yourself, to calm yourself and feel good?
Yeah, I'm a big reader, books of all descriptions, fiction and non-fiction, and ranging from very worthy fiction to what in the old days we would have called an airport thriller, in the days that we used to go to airports and run through bookshops and buy a page turner. So I always find that, reading, losing myself in reading, I find that restorative. I've become a big podcast listener and audiobook listener, and I find combining walking and listening to something that intrigues me is also a good thing to do. In terms of people who've had a real effect on my life, obviously my family, my parents, but also a woman called Joan Kerner, who was the first woman to be Premier of the state of Victoria, so the governor equivalent if we were looking at US politics. And she was a great friend and mentor to me for all of her life.
And I'm sure you're an inspiration to many women and girls. Thank you so much for being here today. It's been a real honour for me to be in conversation with you. And thank you so much to everyone at home for joining us today. Everyone can play a part in creating change and helping to build fairer societies, whether it's mentoring a student to reach their potential, funding research that will help address structural inequalities, or supporting efforts to get more women studying STEM subjects at King's, which I am all for. I'm here for that. So if you'd like to find out more about how you can help the brilliant work of the Global Institute of Women's Leadership and how you can get involved, please do get in touch with the alumni and supporter development team at King's. But for now, thank you for watching and for your questions, and to you, the remarkable Julia Gillard. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.